The winter of 1945 on the Eastern Front was one of desperation, collapse, and violent clashes that carried the war into the heart of Central Europe. After the Great Soviet Offensive in January, Operation Vistula Oder, the Red Army had stormed across Poland, broken through German defenses on the Vistula line, and reached the Oder River by the end of the month. For Germany, this sudden and deep penetration of Soviet armies meant that the Reich itself was under direct threat. Within weeks, Soviet forces stood only 60 kilometers from Berlin. Yet while the main weight of the Red Army prepared for the final assault on the German capital, other fronts still burned. In Lower Silesia, a region of industrial and logistical significance, Soviet armies pressed forward, seeking to collapse the last remaining German positions in the south of the Reich. Silesia had long been recognized as strategically vital. Its coal, steel, and manufacturing resources fed the German war machine, and its railways served as critical arteries connecting the Eastern Front with the heartland of Germany. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, understood that controlling this region would not only deprive Germany of its industrial base, but also open further pathways into Bohemia, Saxony, and ultimately southern Germany. For the Germans, therefore, defending Silesia was more than symbolic resistance. It was one of the few areas where the Reich could still mount meaningful defensive operations with the hope of delaying or even temporarily reversing Soviet gains. In February 1945, the Soviet First Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Ivan Konev, advanced into Lower Silesia. His forces, composed of both seasoned Guards armies and powerful armored formations, had already delivered heavy blows during the January offensive. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Pavel Rybalko, spearheaded this drive. With hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns, supported by rifle divisions and artillery, it represented one of the Red Army's most formidable armored groupings. Their mission was straightforward: to push west, take the Silesian rail junctions, and break open the German defenses in the region. Opposing them stood remnants of the German Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner. Known for his strict discipline and uncompromising orders, Schörner had the unenviable task of stabilizing a collapsing front with depleted units. His formations included Wehrmacht infantry divisions, worn down by years of fighting, as well as some panzer divisions that, though still capable, were weakened in numbers and resources. The German position was further complicated by the lack of reserves, shortages of fuel, and an overstretched logistical system. Yet morale, at least among some units, remained surprisingly resilient, fueled by the belief that Silesia could still be defended and that local counterblows might buy time for the Reich. Within this context, the small Silesian town of Lauban assumed outsized importance. Located along key rail lines and serving as a communications hub, it became the focal point of Soviet attempts to secure the area and German efforts to resist. By late February, Soviet spearheads were pressing toward the town, aiming to cut off German defenders and secure the road to Görlitz and further westward. For civilians in Lauban and surrounding villages, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Refugees from the east crowded the roads, fleeing before the advancing Red Army. German authorities struggled to organize evacuations, while at the same time pressing civilians into labor for fortifications. For the Soviets, the advance into Lauban was expected to be a straightforward continuation of their January successes. After all, the Wehrmacht had been in retreat across nearly the entire front, and there was little reason to expect a determined counterstroke in this sector. For the Germans, however, Lauban presented an opportunity. Schörner, working with the commanders of the local panzer formations, identified the Soviet thrust as overextended. The 3rd Guards Tank Army had moved rapidly and risked outrunning its infantry support. Supply lines were stretched. The terrain of Silesia with its hills and river valleys presented challenges for armored movement, and the German defenders, though limited, could strike at the exposed Soviet flanks. The atmosphere on both sides reflected contrasting expectations. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of advance, believed that victory was inevitable, though they still faced the brutal reality of attrition. German soldiers, by contrast, felt trapped in a collapsing front, but clung to the hope that a counteroffensive here might echo earlier tactical successes, even if only temporarily. In the minds of German commanders, success at Lauban could achieve several aims: restoring local stability, securing the Silesian industrial region for a little longer, and demonstrating to their own population that resistance was not yet futile. By the final days of February 1945, the stage was set. Soviet spearheads had entered the approaches to Lauban, preparing to force their way westward. German forces, under Schörner's orders, began to gather for a sudden strike. Despite shortages in fuel and ammunition, panzer divisions were redeployed with urgency, and infantry units were positioned for coordinated attacks. The clash that would follow would not alter the larger trajectory of the war. Germany remained on the path to defeat. But at Lauban, in early March 1945, the Wehrmacht would achieve one of its last local victories, a rare moment of operational success against the advancing Red Army. In the final days of February 1945, the Soviet push into Lower Silesia intensified, with Lauban directly in the path of the advancing Third Guards Tank Army. The Red Army had enjoyed months of momentum, and its forces were accustomed to the Germans withdrawing before their armored spearheads. On the 28th of February, forward elements of Rybalko's tank formations moved toward Lauban, with the objective of forcing the Germans out of the area and cutting vital communication lines. For Soviet commanders, the task appeared straightforward: overwhelm local defenses, secure the town, and continue pressing west toward Görlitz and the Saxon border. German forces in the sector, however, were not yet broken. The Wehrmacht retained pockets of cohesion, and Schörner's headquarters began preparing to deliver a counterstrike. While many German divisions had been depleted beyond recognition, several mobile formations still possessed combat value. Chief among them were the 8th Panzer Division and the 17th Panzer Division, both reinforced by elements of the Führer-Begleit Division and local Volkssturm units. These formations, though understrength compared to their pre-war establishment, still fielded tanks, self-propelled guns, and enough infantry to mount offensive action. For Schörner, the decision to counterattack was risky, but it represented one of the few opportunities to blunt Soviet progress and prevent the front from collapsing entirely. On March 1st, Soviet forces entered Lauban itself, beginning close quarters fighting with German defenders. Soviet tank units, accompanied by rifle battalions, attempted to push through the narrow streets and establish control of the rail hub. The Germans, however, resisted fiercely. Local Volkssturm detachments, many composed of elderly men and boys, fought alongside regular Wehrmacht troops in desperate defense. Buildings were fortified, and barricades were erected in anticipation of Soviet armor moving into the town. Despite these preparations, Soviet units succeeded in penetrating deep into Lauban, threatening to secure the center by evening. As this battle developed, Schörner ordered the counterattack to begin. German panzers, supported by artillery and assault guns, struck at the flanks of the advancing Soviet columns. Their timing proved critical. Soviet tank brigades had outrun much of their infantry support, leaving their supply convoys and rear echelons exposed. The German attack, launched from the north and south of Lauban, sought to encircle the spearhead and isolate the Red Army units now inside the town. Reports from the Soviet side described heavy shelling and sudden German armor thrusts that disrupted command and communication. The initial hours of the German counteroffensive surprised the Soviets. After weeks of near uninterrupted advance, encountering concentrated German attacks of this scale was unexpected. Soviet tank crews attempted to redeploy and resist, but German anti-tank weapons and well-prepared firing positions inflicted losses. The narrow Silesian terrain, with rivers, woods, and ridges, limited Soviet maneuverability and provided opportunities for the Germans to ambush. Civilians, still present in large numbers, suffered greatly during these exchanges. Streets filled with refugees were caught between tank battles, artillery fire, and collapsing buildings. Command structures on both sides faced immediate challenges. For the Soviets, maintaining momentum in an unexpected urban battle was difficult, as armored thrusts slowed under German pressure. For the Germans, coordinating depleted units into an effective offensive tested their logistics and morale. Schörner's insistence on strict discipline, coupled with the motivation of defending Silesian soil, ensured that his commanders pressed the attack with determination. Reports from German staff officers later indicated that the operation was viewed not merely as a tactical necessity, but also as a symbolic demonstration that the Wehrmacht could still deliver blows against its opponent. By the evening of March 1st, the opening phase of the Battle of Lauban had escalated from a Soviet attempt to seize a local town into a contested clash marked by sudden German counterstrikes. Soviet armored spearheads were in danger of overextension, while German forces prepared to deepen their offensive to encircle and destroy the Red Army elements engaged in Lauban. The stage was set for several days of heavy combat, during which both sides would commit reinforcements and suffer significant losses in pursuit of control over this strategic Silesian junction. The fighting for Lauban in early March 1945 was shaped as much by planning and strategic objectives as by the sudden ferocity of the opening clashes. Both sides had entered the battle with different assumptions about the outcome. For the Soviets, the overarching goal of Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front remained the steady drive into Silesia and the ultimate outflanking of German positions further south. The 3rd Guards Tank Army under General Rybalko was designated as the striking force, tasked with securing Lauban quickly to clear the way toward Görlitz and the Neisse River. Possessing several tank and mechanized corps, the Army fielded hundreds of T-34/85s, heavy IS-2 tanks, and self-propelled artillery, supported by rifle divisions for consolidation. Soviet staff anticipated that German resistance in this sector would mirror what they had encountered in Poland, fragmented and unable to sustain organized counteroffensives. German strategic thinking, however, diverged sharply from Soviet expectations. Field Marshal Schörner, commander of Army Group Center, recognized that the Soviet thrust into Lower Silesia posed a direct threat to both the Reich's industrial resources and the security of the approaches to Dresden and southern Germany. Though his command was strained, Schörner insisted that offensive action could stabilize the front. His decision to launch a counteroffensive around Lauban was not spontaneous. It reflected both operational necessity and political pressure from Berlin. Hitler's headquarters demanded that no further withdrawals occur in Silesia and that local counterattacks demonstrate the Wehrmacht's continued fighting capacity. The German plan centered on concentrating available armored formations to strike at the exposed flanks of Rybalko's spearheads. The 8th Panzer Division, though weakened, still retained around 30 to 40 operational tanks, primarily Panzerfürsts and Panthers, supported by assault guns from Sturmgeschütz brigades. The 17th Panzer Division contributed additional armor and mechanized infantry, while remnants of the Führer Bakelite Division and ad hoc battle groups filled gaps. German planners envisioned a pincer attack that would envelop Soviet elements inside Lauban, cutting them off from their supporting echelons. Artillery and Naval-Werfer rocket launchers were assigned to disrupt Soviet attempts to regroup. Logistics were strained, as fuel shortages meant careful rationing of armored movements, but Schörner believed speed and surprise would compensate. For the Soviets, the planning process had overlooked several critical vulnerabilities. The rapid advance of armored units, while effective in reaching Lauban quickly, left supply columns and rifle divisions several kilometers behind. Ammunition and fuel reserves were stretched thin. In addition, communication between forward tank brigades and higher headquarters suffered from both distance and German interference. Intelligence estimates underestimated the strength and readiness of German panzer formations still operating in the region. This miscalculation would prove costly when the counteroffensive struck. Political and propaganda dimensions also framed the battle. In Berlin, Nazi leadership sought to present Silesia as a fortress that could not be abandoned. Reports from the front were shaped into narratives of heroic defense, intended to reassure a civilian population now witnessing Allied bombings in the west and Soviet advances in the east. In Moscow, Stavka regarded the Lower Silesian operations as preparatory for the eventual Berlin offensive. Capturing Lauban was supposed to symbolize the unstoppable momentum of the Red Army. For both regimes, therefore, the struggle for a relatively small Silesian town carried political weight beyond its immediate tactical significance. The strategies employed highlighted doctrinal contrasts. Soviet planning emphasized deep operations, powerful armored thrusts aiming to disrupt and dislocate the enemy. German planning in 1945, by contrast, relied increasingly on localized counterattacks, using armor to cut exposed spearheads and restore lines. The Wehrmacht no longer possessed the capacity for large-scale strategic offensives, but in sectors like Lauban, it could still generate enough force for sharp operational blows. The convergence of these doctrines at Lauban created a volatile battlefield where both sides misjudged the other's resilience. As preparations concluded on both sides, the stage was set for the next phase. Soviet tank columns, convinced of a rapid victory, pressed into Lauban with limited infantry support. German panzer groups maneuvered into position on the flanks, waiting for the order to strike. Civilians, already caught in evacuation convoys or hiding in basements, braced for the impact of another round of heavy fighting. The contrasting goals, Soviet expansion deeper into Germany and German determination to hold Silesia at all costs, ensured that the battle would escalate into one of the fiercest local clashes in the region during the final months of the war. In the opening days of March 1945, the clash for Lauban shifted from maneuver to brutal engagements that would define the character of the battle. Soviet forces had entered the town, expecting to consolidate their hold quickly, but the sudden German counteroffensive turned what might have been a routine capture into a fierce contest. Lauban's streets, its railway yards, and the surrounding hills became contested ground where tanks, infantry, and artillery collided in close proximity. On March 1st, the forward brigades of Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army advanced into Lauban with momentum. 34/85s rolled into the outskirts supported by ISU 122 and SU 100 self-propelled guns. Soviet riflemen followed, clearing houses and railway buildings. By evening, Soviet reports noted partial control of the town, but resistance remained. Local German garrisons and hastily assembled Volkssturm detachments refused to withdraw, fighting from fortified cellars, barricaded streets, and church towers. For the Red Army, the expectation of swift collapse was immediately replaced by house-to-house combat, where tanks became vulnerable, and progress was measured in meters. The German counterstroke unfolded with precise timing. At dawn on the 2nd of March, elements of the 8th Panzer Division launched an attack from the north, supported by Nebelwerfer rocket barrages that set parts of the town ablaze. The 17th Panzer Division struck from the south, attempting to link with northern forces to form an encirclement ring. Their armored spearheads, composed of Panzer IVs and Panthers, advanced through villages and wooded ridges that flanked the Soviet spearhead. Assault gun brigades provided firepower against Soviet armor, while infantry units dug in along key road junctions to hold any Soviet attempts to break free. The Soviet response was immediate but strained. Rybalko ordered his units inside Lauban to hold positions while reinforcements were rushed forward. However, the depth of Soviet deployment meant rifle divisions and artillery support were still several kilometers behind, struggling through congested supply routes and damaged infrastructure. Soviet tank brigades in the town soon faced isolation, with ammunition dwindling and communication with higher command disrupted by German shelling. Reports describe Soviet tanks forced into static defense, using their guns as makeshift artillery against advancing German formations. Civilian accounts from Lauban, gathered after the war, depict the terror of those days. Families crowded into basements as artillery shells struck residential blocks. Fires spread uncontrolled, fed by wooden structures and warehouses. Refugees attempting to flee westward found themselves caught between Soviet and German lines, their carts and belongings abandoned along roads turned into battlefields. For many, survival meant hiding underground for days while battles raged above. The fighting on the 2nd of March intensified around the railway station, a vital objective for both sides. Soviet troops clung to its ruins, while German assault groups attacked repeatedly, supported by tanks firing directly into the station walls. Control of the station shifted multiple times during the day. In the southern sector, Soviet units attempted counterattacks with IS-2 heavy tanks, managing to halt several German thrusts but at the cost of heavy losses. German Panther crews, benefiting from prepared ambushes, knocked out several Soviet heavy tanks in narrow streets where maneuver was impossible. By March 3rd, the German pincers had closed tighter around Lauban. Soviet forward elements were increasingly cut off from their rear echelons, and German units began pressing into the town from both flanks. The 8th Panzer Division reported destroying dozens of Soviet tanks in 2 days, while Soviet reports acknowledged significant equipment losses but emphasized their determination to hold. Rybalko faced a critical dilemma: commit more forces to save the units in Lauban or order a withdrawal to avoid encirclement. Stavka's directives emphasized the importance of maintaining offensive momentum, discouraging withdrawals, but reality on the ground pointed to a looming disaster if Soviet units remained trapped. The German strategy demonstrated careful coordination despite resource shortages. Schörner's headquarters ensured that artillery concentrations targeted Soviet supply convoys on roads east of Lauban, further isolating frontline units. Fuel shortages were managed by prioritizing panzer movements for critical thrusts, while less mobile infantry units held defensive sectors. Luftwaffe support was minimal due to the overall collapse of German air power, but occasional sorties by WW190 fighter bombers added to Soviet difficulties. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders sought to stabilize their position. Reinforcements from the 52nd Army and supporting rifle divisions attempted to push westward into Lauban, but German defenses on the flanks held firm. Soviet artillery barrages struck villages now under German control, but the counteroffensive had momentum. The Red Army faced not only tactical setbacks, but also the psychological shock of encountering an opponent still capable of coordinated offensive action after weeks of retreat. The civilian population bore the brunt of the escalation. Reports of executions, reprisals, and forced evacuations appeared on both sides. German authorities accused civilians of collaboration when Soviet forces temporarily held parts of Lauban, while Soviet troops often treated remaining civilians with suspicion. For ordinary inhabitants, survival depended on shifting control of their neighborhoods, with some forced to endure shelling by both armies within the same day. By the evening of March 3rd, the battle entered its critical stage. German panzer groups had forced Soviet elements inside Lauban into defensive pockets, while the town itself was devastated by shelling and fires. The Soviet spearhead that had so confidently pushed westward now faced the risk of annihilation. For the Germans, the chance to recapture the town and claim a rare tactical victory appeared within reach. Yet both sides prepared to commit further reinforcements, ensuring that the following days would bring even more intense and destructive fighting. The first engagements of the Battle of Lauban revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the opposing forces. The Red Army retained immense power and determination, but its doctrine of deep armored thrusts left vulnerabilities when supply and infantry support lagged. The Wehrmacht, though weakened, showed it could still exploit such vulnerabilities with well-timed counteroffensives. The convergence of these factors turned Lauban into one of the most contested battlefields of early 1945, a place where the momentum of the Soviet advance briefly faltered against concentrated German resistance. The days that followed the first engagements in Lauban transformed the battle from a local clash into a broader crisis that reverberated across both Soviet and German command structures. By March 4, 1945, the Soviet spearheads inside the town were heavily engaged, cut off from secure lines of communication, and under pressure from multiple German thrusts. What had begun as an operation to seize a key Silesian junction was evolving into a critical test of momentum, morale, and command flexibility. The German counteroffensive expanded in scope as Schörner committed all available formations. The 8th Panzer Division pushed its attacks north of Lauban, aiming to complete the encirclement of Soviet units inside the town. The 17th Panzer Division pressed from the south, coordinating with infantry battle groups that sealed off escape routes. Additional forces, including remnants of the Führer Grenadier Brigade and locally raised Volkssturm units, were assigned to block Soviet reinforcements moving from the east. The Germans deployed their limited armor in concentrated thrusts, making efficient use of terrain and prepared ambush points. Reports indicate that by the evening of March 4th, German units had effectively cut off several Soviet tank brigades, leaving them surrounded within Lauban. For the Soviets, the crisis was immediate. General Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army had advanced too quickly. and now its leading elements faced the danger of being destroyed in isolation. Soviet staff officers attempted to organize relief efforts by ordering supporting rifle divisions and artillery to break through the German ring, but terrain and German resistance slowed their progress. Soviet tanks inside Lauban were forced to ration ammunition, while infantry units fought in small groups from building to building. Supplies were short, and the lack of secure medical evacuation meant that wounded soldiers remained in improvised shelters. The fighting during these days was characterized by its intensity. German Panther tanks engaged Soviet T-34/85s at close range in the ruined streets, often less than 200 meters apart. The advantage alternated between the sides depending on terrain and ambush positions. German assault guns, such as Stu-Gs2s and Jagdpanzers 4s, provided effective firepower from concealed positions. Soviet IS-2 heavy tanks, though formidable, were often hampered by the narrow streets where mobility was restricted. Many became static strongpoints, using their 122mm guns as direct-fire artillery against German infantry. Weather conditions added to the difficulties. Early March brought alternating snow and thaw, turning fields into mud and reducing visibility. German supply convoys struggled to maintain fuel deliveries to their panzers, while Soviet relief forces faced similar challenges as artillery pieces bogged down in soft ground. The logistical crisis grew sharper each day. Without steady resupply, Soviet armored units trapped in Lauban could not maintain operations indefinitely. Civilian experiences underscored the human cost of the crisis. Eyewitness accounts described constant shelling, collapsed buildings, and the streets filled with debris and bodies. Civilians who had not evacuated earlier were trapped, forced to seek shelter in basements while battles raged overhead. Food supplies dwindled, wells were contaminated by bombardments, and communication with the outside world ceased. Many inhabitants later recalled that survival became indistinguishable from chance, as artillery shells fell indiscriminately. The crisis extended beyond the battlefield into the realm of politics and propaganda. In Berlin, the German High Command seized on reports of successful counterattacks around Lauban as evidence that the Wehrmacht could still resist. Goebbels' propaganda ministry announced that Silesia had become a fortress where German soldiers were halting the Red Army, framing the battle as a symbol of national resilience. In Moscow, however, the temporary Soviet setback was downplayed. Official statements emphasized the continued advance of the Red Army on other fronts, and avoided details about difficulties in Silesia. This contrast highlighted how both regimes manipulated information to maintain morale among populations increasingly weary of the war. Strategically, the escalation of the Battle of Lauban had consequences for the broader Eastern Front. Schörner's success in concentrating forces for the counteroffensive temporarily stabilized Army Group Center's defensive line in Silesia. It delayed Soviet plans to push deeper into southern Germany and diverted resources that could have been employed elsewhere. For the Soviets, the need to recover from unexpected losses slowed their timetable, though Stavka still viewed Silesia as secondary compared to the forthcoming Berlin operation. By March 5th, the battle reached a point where both sides recognized the stakes. The Germans fought to maintain their encirclement and claim a decisive victory, while the Soviets sought to break free and preserve their armored strength. The situation for Rybalko's spearheads became increasingly precarious, as reports indicated fuel and ammunition reserves were nearly exhausted. Commanders debated whether to attempt breakout operations under cover of night or to hold positions until reinforcements could arrive. Neither option promised an easy solution. The crisis at Lauban illuminated broader truths about the state of the war. In spring 1945, the Red Army was powerful, but its rapid operational tempo exposed vulnerabilities when supply and infantry coordination lagged. The Wehrmacht, though in overall decline, could still achieve localized successes by exploiting those vulnerabilities with concentrated counterattacks. Both armies, in their different ways, were straining under the weight of exhaustion, attrition, and the enormous human toll of years of continuous fighting. The next stage of the battle would determine whether the German counteroffensive would achieve its goal of destroying significant Soviet formations, or whether Soviet reinforcements would succeed in breaking the encirclement. Either outcome promised further destruction for the town of Lauban, which by now was little more than rubble and ash. For soldiers and civilians alike, the escalation of fighting in those first days of March represented a moment when the front lines of global war converged on a single Silesian town, drawing it into the broader catastrophe of 1945. By March 6, 1945, the struggle for Lauban had reached its peak, marked by the heaviest concentration of men and material that the area had yet witnessed. German commanders, sensing that the moment for a decisive outcome was at hand, pressed their forces into the town and surrounding countryside with determination. For Schörner and his staff, success at Lauban meant more than tactical gain. It was an opportunity to restore confidence, secure the Silesian front, and demonstrate that the Wehrmacht could still strike effectively. For the Soviets, the battle represented an unexpected reversal, threatening not only immediate losses, but also the credibility of their continued advance through Lower Silesia. Inside the town, combat raged from street to street. German armored spearheads attempted to split the Soviet pocket into smaller segments, concentrating on isolating strong points and then reducing them with artillery and direct fire. The ruins of the railway station, factories, and residential blocks became fortresses defended by Soviet tank crews and infantry. Every major building that remained standing was contested. Soviet IS-2 tanks, positioned at intersections, fired at close range against German infantry assaults, while T-34/85s maneuvered through alleyways, sometimes firing point-blank into German-held houses. German assault engineers responded with flamethrowers and demolition charges, clearing buildings one by one in costly advances. The countryside around Lauban was equally violent. German units on the northern and southern flanks continued to press inward, gradually constricting the Soviet pocket. The 8th Panzer Division, coordinating closely with the 17th Panzer, reported destroying dozens of Soviet vehicles over the course of several days. Their losses, though significant, were offset by the ability to dictate the tempo of battle. Soviet relief forces attempting to break the ring faced carefully positioned German defenses, where anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust-equipped infantry ambushed advancing columns. Soviet artillery barrages inflicted destruction, but were unable to open decisive gaps. For Soviet troops trapped within Lauban, the conditions deteriorated rapidly. Ammunition stocks dwindled, with tank crews rationing shells and infantry units short of grenades. Food and medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Wounded soldiers filled cellars and improvised field stations, many unable to be evacuated. Soviet commanders urged their troops to hold, promising relief. But morale suffered as German pressure increased daily. The once aggressive tank brigades of Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army now fought defensively, clinging to fragments of the town and waiting for reinforcement. The Germans, for their part, faced their own burdens. Fuel shortages limited the mobility of panzer units, forcing careful planning of every armored thrust. Ammunition stocks, particularly for artillery, were consumed at unsustainable rates. Infantry formations, including Volkssturm and ad hoc battle groups, endured heavy casualties and repeated assaults on fortified Soviet positions. Yet the sense of impending success provided momentum. German propaganda officers circulated among the troops, emphasizing that the defense of Silesia was crucial for the homeland. Soldiers were told that their efforts in Lauban were being broadcast as proof that the Reich still fought with determination. Civilians caught in the middle experienced the peak of destruction. Bombardments had leveled much of the town, leaving streets choked with rubble and bodies. Fires burned unchecked. Refugees trapped in Lauban were forced into cellars with little food or water, emerging only when the shelling subsided. Accounts describe scenes of desperation, families huddled in darkness, children carried across ruined streets under gunfire, and the constant fear of being buried alive as buildings collapsed under artillery strikes. At the operational level, both sides recognized that the coming days would decide the outcome. Schörner concentrated his reserves to complete the encirclement and clear the town fully of Soviet forces. Rybalko pleaded for reinforcement from higher command, but Stavka's priorities remained fixed on preparing for larger offensives toward Berlin, limiting the resources available for Lauban. the Soviet High Command weighed the risks of committing additional forces to a battle that, in their assessment, was increasingly secondary. The peak of the battle highlighted the contradictions of the war in its final months. The Red Army, overwhelming in scale and strength, could still be checked by local miscalculations and determined German counterattacks. The Wehrmacht, though hollowed by years of attrition, could still inflict sharp blows when circumstances aligned. Lauban became one of those rare places where the tide of war briefly shifted, not because of strategic transformation, but through the convergence of tactical opportunity, desperation, and the will of soldiers forced into a fight for survival. By the close of March 6th, Lauban was a shattered landscape of ruins, its strategic railway hub destroyed, its streets contested at every corner. Soviet forces remained inside the pocket, battered but resisting, while German divisions pressed relentlessly to complete their victory. The following days would determine whether the encircled Soviet troops could be relieved or whether the German counteroffensive would achieve its last operational successes of the war. The German counteroffensive at Lauban, having reached its height, now entered a phase of resistance and adaptation on both sides. Neither the Red Army nor the Wehrmacht could rely solely on their original plans. As the fighting dragged into its second week of March 1945, improvisation, endurance, and the ability to adjust to collapsing circumstances defined the course of the battle. For the Germans, the continuation of offensive action demanded careful resource management. Their armored divisions were worn down by days of constant fighting. Fuel stocks were nearly gone, and ammunition was running dangerously low. Yet German commanders used mobility in short bursts, sending panzer companies on limited, concentrated thrusts rather than extended operations. The goal was no longer sweeping maneuvers, but repeated hammer blows at Soviet strongpoints. Infantry units adapted by forming small assault groups that advanced from house to house, equipped with grenades, flamethrowers, and panzerfausts. These groups suffered high casualties, but gradually cleared sections of Lauban, tightening the noose on Soviet defenders. The Soviets responded with equally adaptive measures. Rybalko's tank brigades, trapped within Lauban, could no longer maneuver as cohesive armored units. Instead, individual tanks and small platoons acted as mobile bunkers, positioned at intersections or behind barricades to block German advances. Rifle divisions, though short of supplies, fortified basements, dug trenches through rubble, and turned collapsed buildings into firing positions. Communication with higher command remained erratic, but local officers exercised initiative, directing resistance wherever possible. Soviet artillery outside the pocket fired massive barrages in an attempt to disrupt German formations, though accuracy was limited, and much of the town was reduced to ruins in the process. Improvisation extended beyond the battlefield. German medical units established makeshift hospitals and cellars in schools, operating with minimal equipment. Soviet wounded, unable to be evacuated, relied on improvised aid from comrades and civilians. Civilians themselves were forced into adaptive survival. Wells were dug inside ruins to secure water. Food was scavenged from abandoned houses, and cellars became permanent shelters. The population endured constant fear, with shifts in control leaving them uncertain which army would be in charge from one day to the next. Psychological strain weighed heavily on both sides. German propaganda celebrated the counteroffensive as proof of resilience, but soldiers on the ground understood the fragility of their success. Many wrote in diaries or recounted later that they sensed the victory at Lauban, even if achieved, could not alter the war's outcome. Soviet troops, accustomed to advancing steadily westward, were stunned by the scale of the German counterblow. For many, the battle became a test of endurance under conditions they had not faced since earlier stages of the war. Officers emphasized discipline and the inevitability of Soviet reinforcement, even as losses mounted. Partisan and auxiliary elements also influenced the dynamics. In rural Silesia, remnants of local resistance movements attempted to provide intelligence, though their impact was limited by the intensity of frontline combat. German authorities, wary of sabotage, imposed strict control over the countryside, diverting manpower that might otherwise have reinforced the front. Soviet reconnaissance units tried to infiltrate behind German lines, seeking weak points in the encirclement, but faced strong patrols and countermeasures. Innovation in weapons use reflected the desperation of the fighting. German soldiers increasingly relied on portable anti-tank weapons, finding them effective in urban conditions where Soviet armor had little room to maneuver. Soviet units turned captured German weapons against their former owners, including Panzerfausts fired at German assault groups. Both sides adapted their artillery tactics. The Soviets saturated areas suspected of German concentrations, while the Germans focused fire narrowly to conserve shells, often striking at Soviet relief attempts on the town's outskirts. The human toll grew with each passing day. Casualties on both sides climbed into the thousands, though precise figures remain debated. German sources later claimed the destruction of over 300 Soviet tanks during the Lauban fighting, while Soviet records emphasized continued resistance and heavy German losses. Civilians faced starvation, disease, and constant bombardment. For many, survival hinged on improvisation, as much as for the soldiers themselves. By March 7th, the pattern of resistance and adaptation had produced a stalemate of sorts. German forces controlled most approaches to Lauban and much of the town itself, but Soviet defenders still held pockets of resistance. Relief forces outside the encirclement launched repeated but unsuccessful assaults to break through. Both armies had exhausted much of their strength in the struggle, yet neither was willing to concede. The Germans sought to secure a symbolic victory that could bolster morale across the collapsing Reich, while the Soviets sought to preserve their reputation for uninterrupted advance. The battle had become a contest not only of weapons and numbers, but of endurance, improvisation, and psychological resilience. Each side learned quickly from the other, adapting methods of urban combat and resource management under extraordinary pressure. Lauban, by this stage little more than a devastated shell of a town, became the stage on which two exhausted yet determined armies tested the limits of their capacity to fight on in the closing months of the war. By the second week of March 1945, the struggle for Lauban reached its decisive turning point. After days of attritional combat, the German counteroffensive achieved its operational aim: to encircle and cripple the forward elements of the Third Guards Tank Army and to retake the shattered town. For the Soviets, what had begun as a confident thrust westward had now become a fight for survival, with commanders weighing whether to commit additional forces or to accept the necessity of withdrawal. The critical moment came when German armored formations succeeded in linking up their thrusts north and south of Lauban. The 8th Panzer Division, having pressed steadily through villages and forests, closed its advance with elements of the 17th Panzer Division. Their pincers effectively cut the last reliable routes into the town. Soviet attempts to keep corridors open for reinforcement faltered under heavy artillery and close-range Panzerfaust ambushes. The result was the near isolation of Soviet units inside Lauban, who now faced destruction or withdrawal under fire. German control of key terrain, particularly the ridgelines east of the town, provided commanding observation for artillery. From these positions, German gunners could direct fire against Soviet relief attempts. Barrages struck road columns and supply convoys, further disrupting Rybalko's efforts to stabilize the situation. The Soviets countered with massed artillery fire of their own, but the intensity of German resistance on the approaches rendered relief operations ineffective. Soviet armored thrusts outside the town suffered heavy losses as panzers and assault guns exploited the terrain to spring ambushes. Within Lauban itself, Soviet defenders realized the precariousness of their position. Reports indicate that fuel for tanks was nearly exhausted, leaving many armored vehicles immobilized. Infantry units, short of ammunition, resorted to conserving fire and holding fortified cellars at all costs. Morale weakened as communication with higher headquarters collapsed, replaced by isolated group resistance. German units, though also strained, exploited the situation. Assault groups advanced systematically, clearing block after block. By 8th March, much of Lauban was under German control, though Soviet strongpoints continued to resist in the ruins of factories and railway installations. The decision from Soviet command was clear: preserving combat strength was more important than holding ground. Stavka authorized a withdrawal to avoid the complete destruction of valuable tank formations. Under cover of night and with heavy artillery support, Soviet units began pulling out of Lauban, abandoning damaged equipment and leaving behind dead and wounded. For many trapped within the pocket, however, retreat was impossible. German forces reported capturing prisoners in the hundreds, while others fought to the last in isolated positions. The German recapture of Lauban was proclaimed as a significant success. Propaganda outlets announced the destruction of entire Soviet brigades, broadcasting the news as evidence that the Reich still possessed the power to resist. The local victory, while modest in scale compared to the vast operations unfolding elsewhere, provided a psychological boost to both German troops and civilians. Newspapers emphasized that Silesia remained in German hands, at least temporarily, and that the enemy had been thrown back. On the Soviet side, the turning point was treated with restraint. Official reports minimized the setback, focusing instead on operations elsewhere along the front. The withdrawal from Lauban was framed as a tactical adjustment rather than a defeat. In practice, the loss of the town and the destruction of armored units inside the pocket forced the First Ukrainian Front to adjust its timetable for operations in Lower Silesia. Though the setback did not alter the overall trajectory of the war, it represented one of the rare occasions in 1945 when the Red Army was forced to relinquish ground to a German counteroffensive. For civilians, the turning point offered little relief. The recapture of Lauban by German forces did not end the devastation. Those who had survived the Soviet advance now endured reprisals and renewed destruction. Many houses had been reduced to rubble, food supplies were gone, and disease spread quickly in the ruins. The town's population, once numbering in the tens of thousands, dwindled as refugees fled westward or were evacuated by German authorities. The human cost of the turning point was measured not only in military losses, but also in the collapse of an entire community. By mid-March, the outcome of the Battle of Lauban was settled. The Wehrmacht had succeeded in one of its last operational victories, retaking a strategic town and inflicting significant losses on Soviet armored units. For the Soviets, the turning point demonstrated that even in 1945, the enemy retained the capacity to surprise and disrupt. Yet for both sides, the larger context remained unchanged. Germany was in retreat on every other front, and Soviet forces would regroup to continue their advance toward Berlin within weeks. Lauban, though significant locally, was only a temporary pause in the wider collapse of the Reich. By the middle of March 1945, the battle for Lauban had effectively ended in a German victory, though at immense cost to both armies and the town itself. With the Soviet spearheads forced to withdraw under pressure, the Wehrmacht secured the ruins of Lauban and could claim one of its last tactical successes of the war. Yet what followed was not triumph in any enduring sense, but rather the grim aftermath of days of combat and the recognition that even victories in 1945 came at a devastating price. German troops entered the final clearing operations with methodical determination. Soviet strongpoints, which had resisted until the last, were reduced through concentrated artillery fire, close-quarter assaults, and demolition teams. By March 9th, most Soviet defenders who had not withdrawn were either dead, captured, or isolated in pockets too small to influence the outcome. German reports listed hundreds of prisoners taken, along with large numbers of destroyed or abandoned tanks and guns. These tallies were used in propaganda broadcasts to portray the counteroffensive as a decisive blow, though historians later questioned the accuracy of such figures. Regardless of the numbers, the destruction of Soviet armored units at Lauban was undeniable. The town itself was left devastated. Once a functioning rail hub and small industrial center, Lauban had been reduced to rubble. Residential districts lay in ruins from artillery and rocket barrages. The railway station was a gutted shell, and fires smoldered for days. Civilian casualties were heavy, though precise figures remain uncertain. Many residents who had not fled earlier were killed in the crossfire, buried under collapsed buildings, or succumbed to starvation and exposure during the siege. Survivors emerged from cellars to a shattered landscape, where streets were lined with wrecked vehicles and bodies of soldiers from both sides. The withdrawal of Soviet forces marked the end of direct combat, but not of hardship. German authorities quickly reimposed control, instituting strict security measures and reprisals against civilians suspected of collaboration during the days of Soviet occupation. Refugees continued to pour westward, clogging roads already strained by military traffic. German propaganda framed these scenes as evidence of civilian loyalty and resistance, yet the reality was one of exhaustion and despair. Families torn apart by flight or death faced uncertain futures as the front lines continued to shift across Silesia. For the Wehrmacht, the aftermath presented logistical and operational challenges. While Lauban had been recaptured, the divisions involved were severely depleted. The 8th and 17th Panzer Divisions, though successful in their coordinated attacks, had lost a significant portion of their remaining armored strength. Infantry units endured unsustainable casualties, particularly among Volkssturm and hastily raised battle groups. Supplies expended during the counteroffensive could not easily be replaced. German commanders knew that, despite the victory, their capacity for further large-scale counteroffensives was practically exhausted. On the Soviet side, the withdrawal forced a reassessment. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, though not destroyed, suffered losses that required time and reinforcement to recover. Rybalko's forces were pulled back, reorganized, and resupplied for future operations. The Red Army's response to the setback was pragmatic. Rather than attempting to retake Lauban immediately, Stavka redirected resources to secure other sectors and prepare for the forthcoming Berlin offensive. Soviet planning emphasized that the war was not decided in Silesia, but at the gates of Berlin. Thus, while Lauban represented a local defeat, it did not alter the strategic momentum driving the Red Army westward. The civilian aftermath illustrated the human cost of these shifting military priorities. For residents of Lauban and the surrounding villages, life was marked by destruction, loss, and displacement. Accounts describe children searching among ruins for food, elderly civilians attempting to rebuild shelters from rubble, and entire families separated in the chaos of evacuation. Medical care was scarce, and epidemics threatened populations already weakened by malnutrition. The experience of Lauban mirrored that of countless towns across Central Europe in 1945. Survival amid ruins created by armies locked in a struggle for control of territory that often had little lasting significance compared to the destruction it produced. Internationally, the battle barely registered at the time. Western Allied newspapers reported briefly on a German counterattack in Silesia, but the focus of global attention remained on the impending collapse of the Reich and the political arrangements for post-war Europe. Within Germany, however, Lauban was presented as proof that the Wehrmacht remained capable of delivering meaningful blows. Goebbels' propaganda machine highlighted the victory as a rallying point, with headlines declaring that the Soviet advance had been stopped and that German arms had triumphed against overwhelming odds. For a civilian population enduring bombings and anticipating invasion, such reports offered temporary reassurance, though most understood the broader reality of Germany's military situation. From a military perspective, the aftermath of Lauban highlighted the futility of German successes in 1945. Though the battle inflicted serious losses on Soviet forces and bought time for the defense of Silesia, it could not alter the strategic balance. The Red Army retained overwhelming superiority in manpower, equipment, and reserves. Within weeks, Soviet armies resumed their westward advance, forcing German withdrawals across the entire front. Lauban, secured at great cost, would soon be threatened again as the tide of war continued to press inexorably toward Berlin. By late March, the ruins of Lauban stood as both a symbol and a warning. For Germany, it represented one of the last moments where tactical skill and determination produced a clear battlefield success. For the Soviets, it was a reminder that even near the end of the war, complacency could lead to costly reverses. For the civilians who had lived through it, however, it was simply a disaster, the destruction of their homes, the loss of loved ones, and the collapse of a way of life that would never return. Thus, the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Lauban was not one of clear triumph or defeat, but of devastation. The Wehrmacht had won the field, but the strategic war continued to slip further from its grasp. The Soviets had suffered a temporary setback, but their overwhelming strength guaranteed that Lauban would be remembered not as a turning point, but as a fleeting interruption in their march toward Berlin. The Battle of Lauban occupies a unique place in the final months of the Second World War, remembered as one of the last instances in which the Wehrmacht achieved a local tactical success against the Red Army. Yet its legacy is complex, shaped by military, political, and cultural interpretations that emerged in the decades following 1945. For contemporaries, Lauban symbolized resilience or vulnerability, depending on perspective. For historians, it illustrates both the capacity of the German army to exploit opportunities even in collapse, and the Red Army's ability to recover from setbacks in pursuit of broader strategic goals. Militarily, Lauban demonstrated the persistence of German operational skill. Despite shortages of manpower, fuel, and equipment, Schörner's command concentrated mobile forces, coordinated them effectively, and exploited Soviet overextension. The successful use of panzer divisions in a pincer attack revealed that the Wehrmacht still possessed pockets of tactical capability. Yet the limitations were equally clear. Losses suffered in armor, fuel expenditure, and manpower could not be replaced. The victory delayed Soviet advances in Silesia for only a short time. Within weeks, the Red Army resumed its push, securing Lower Silesia and preparing for the Berlin offensive. Thus, Lauban was never more than a temporary halt in the Soviet march toward final victory. For the Soviets, Lauban became an example of the dangers of overconfidence and rapid advances without sufficient infantry support. The setback forced operational adjustments, reminding commanders that even in 1945, the enemy could not be underestimated. While the withdrawal was downplayed in official accounts, Soviet military doctrine after the battle reflected greater attention to coordination between armored and rifle units. In this sense, Lauban was a costly lesson rather than a decisive failure, absorbed into the broader narrative of the Red Army's relentless drive to Berlin. Politically, the battle carried symbolic weight in both Berlin and Moscow. In Nazi Germany, the recapture of Lauban was used by Goebbels' propaganda machine as evidence that the Reich could still resist. Newspaper headlines and radio broadcasts celebrated the Fortress of Silesia and portrayed the defeat of Soviet spearheads as proof of national strength. For a population facing daily air raids and the approach of Allied forces, such reports offered fleeting morale. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, the episode was largely omitted from wartime propaganda. Emphasis remained on continued successes elsewhere, ensuring that the Red Army's image of unstoppable progress was preserved. Only in post-war military studies did Soviet historians acknowledge Lauban as an example of German resistance in the war's final phase. The civilian legacy of the battle is perhaps the most tragic. Lauban, like many towns in Central Europe, was destroyed in the crossfire of armies struggling for temporary advantage. Its population endured bombardment, starvation, and reprisals, with many displaced permanently. After 1945, as borders shifted and Silesia became part of Poland, the memory of Lauban passed into contested narratives of war and displacement. German survivors remembered it as the site of loss and destruction. Polish inhabitants who arrived after the war encountered a town in ruins, reshaped during Reconstruction under a new national identity. For both, the battle left scars that extended far beyond military history. In the broader historical debate, Lauban is often cited as one of several last victories of the Wehrmacht, alongside operations such as the defense of Königsberg or the counterattacks near Budapest. Historians generally agree that while these engagements demonstrated continued tactical skill, they had no capacity to reverse the strategic outcome of the war. Lauban thus represents the paradox of late-war German operations, the ability to win battles even as the war itself was irretrievably lost. Commemoration of the battle has reflected these divided legacies. In post-war Germany, particularly among veterans groups, Lauban was remembered as a testament to the endurance of soldiers fighting under hopeless conditions. In Poland, the focus shifted to reconstruction and integration of Silesia into the new state, with the wartime destruction often overshadowed by broader narratives of recovery. Soviet accounts, when mentioned, emphasized the resilience of Red Army troops who endured encirclement and losses yet returned to the offensive. Each perspective shaped memory in ways that reflected political needs as much as historical reality. Ultimately, the significance of the Battle of Lauban lies not in its immediate military outcome, but in its place within the wider story of 1945. It encapsulates the contradictions of the war's final months: decisive Soviet superiority tempered by occasional setbacks, German collapse punctuated by fleeting tactical successes, and civilians caught between shifting front lines. Lauban was a battle that changed little in strategic terms, but it revealed much about the character of warfare at the end of the Third Reich: desperate, destructive, and fought with intensity even when the end was certain. For those who study the Second World War, Lauban remains a reminder of the complexity of history. It was not a turning point, nor a decisive confrontation, but a snapshot of a moment when two exhausted armies clashed in the ruins of a Silesian town. Its legacy is measured not only in destroyed tanks and captured prisoners, but in the memory of a community torn apart, in the propaganda that sought to reshape its meaning, and in the enduring lesson that even the last victories of a dying regime could come at an immense cost.